I never thought that a simple trip to Colorado would turn into one of the most disturbing experiences of my life. I've always been skeptical about ghost stories, but after that night at the Stanley Hotel, everything changed. It was a vacation trip with some friends. We wanted a different weekend, and the Stanley seemed perfect. A historic hotel, famous for its beauty and for being the inspiration for The Shining. The idea of staying in such an iconic place excited us. What could possibly go wrong? We arrived at the hotel at dusk. The imposing facade glowed in the golden light, surrounded by mountains. Everything seemed peaceful until night fell. We stayed in room 217, famous for reports of paranormal activity. The receptionist smiled when we got the key, but before saying goodbye, she said something strange. "If you hear footsteps or laughter at night, don't worry. They're just playing around." We thought it was just a joke to scare tourists. We went upstairs laughing, ready for a quiet night. The room was elegant, with antique furniture and a spectacular view of the mountains. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until the bathroom door closed by itself. The sound was loud and echoed throughout the room. We looked at each other, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a draft. I went to check, but the window was closed. I shrugged, trying not to think about it too much. Later, when we were already in bed, silence filled the room. It was then that we heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy and slow, as if someone was walking back and forth, stopping right in front of our door. "Did you hear that?" I asked one of my friends. He nodded, pale. The knocking started. 3 slow, rhythmic knocks on the door. I stood up, trying to look brave, and opened it. No one was there. I quickly closed the door, my heart racing. We went back to bed, trying to convince ourselves that it was just our imagination. But the worst was yet to come. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of laughter, children's laughter. It came from the hallway, echoing softly. I got up slowly and looked through the peephole in the door. The hallway was empty, but the laughter continued, getting closer and closer. Before I could react, the TV turned on by itself, and the static image filled the room with light. A shadowy figure flashed across the screen, and I froze. My friend shouted from across the room, "Someone's here!" The air grew heavy, and a chilly feeling filled the room. Something was with us, watching, waiting. The room was freezing. The TV was still on, showing only static, and the feeling that there was something, or someone, watching us became unbearable. My friend was pale, staring at the corner of the room. There's someone there," he whispered, his voice shaking. I turned around slowly, feeling my heart race with every second. In the corner, near the window, a female figure stood, partially shrouded in shadow. She didn't move, didn't say anything, just watched us. The light from the TV flickered, briefly illuminating her face. Her eyes were empty, like 2 black orbs, and a pale, distorted smile cut across her expression. My body froze. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. She took a step forward, and the floor creaked softly beneath her feet. It was enough to break the trance. "Run!" I screamed. We ran out into the hallway, leaving the door open behind us. The hotel was plunged into an unsettling silence. The lights seemed dimmer, and the hallway, which had seemed ordinary before, now seemed endless, as if it were swallowing us. We ran aimlessly, trying to find the exit. The feeling of being followed was unbearable. I looked back, and, for a brief second, I saw the woman again. She was standing in the doorway of our room, smiling, but her smile was wrong, as if it didn't belong on a human face. We walked down the stairs, panting, and finally reached the lobby. The receptionist looked at us with a calm smile, as if he knew exactly what had happened. "First night in room 217, he asked as he handed us a bottle of water. I nodded, trying to catch my breath. What was that?" He tilted his head and calmly replied, "It was probably Mrs. Wilson. She likes to have visitors, but don't worry, she's just watching." My stomach churned. He was talking like it was normal. Trying not to panic, I asked, "What if she does more than watch?" The receptionist just smiled and said, "Well, that's up to her." We left the hotel that night. We didn't grab our bags or look back. It didn't matter anymore. I knew I would never go back to that place. But what scares me the most, to this day, isn't what happened that night. It's what I brought with me. Ever since then, I've heard soft footsteps in the hallway at night. Sometimes the TV turns on by itself, showing only static. And when I wake up in the middle of the night, I'm sure someone is standing in the corner of my room. I never look, because I know she's still there, waiting for me to notice her again. I have always been fascinated by the history of Salem and its famous witch trials. I decided to visit the city to learn more about the legends and macabre stories. But what I found was much more than just stories. This was real. I arrived late in the afternoon as the sky began to turn red and the cold wind blew through the narrow streets. The old houses, with their dark wooden facades and small windows, seemed to watch me as I walked. The air had a strange smell, a mixture of wet earth and something burning. After a quick visit to the museum, I decided to explore the city on my own. I was curious to see the old Burying Point Cemetery, one of the oldest in the United States, where some of the victims of the trials were buried. The place was practically deserted, except for a couple of tourists who hurried out, casting nervous glances behind them. I entered the cemetery, the silence enveloping me like a heavy blanket. The old tombstones were crooked, some covered in moss, others almost completely illegible. The wind made the dry leaves drag across the ground, creating a low, constant sound. As I walked among the tombstones, something caught my attention. A figure was standing near a tree, wearing an old-fashioned black dress, with her face hidden under a hood. I assumed she was a tour guide dressed up to scare visitors, but the closer I got, the more wrong it seemed. She didn't move. I stood a few feet away from her, waiting for her to say something, but she remained motionless, her back to me. It was then that the wind suddenly stopped, and the silence became so deep that even my footsteps seemed distant. "Do you need help?" I asked, trying to sound calm. The figure turned slowly, and what I saw made my blood run cold. She had no face, just a smooth, pale surface like wax, where her eyes, mouth, and nose should have been. I took a step back, my heart racing. She slowly raised her arm, pointing to something behind me. My breath caught in my chest. I knew I shouldn't look, but I did. A long shadow moved between the tombstones, almost floating. It looked humanoid, but its movements were erratic, as if it wasn't used to walking. The shadow approached faster and faster, and I couldn't move. When I looked back at the woman, she was no longer there. The shadow was only a few feet away from me now, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. That's when the voice whispered, cold and cutting, "You came to us. Now you can't leave." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The shadow was getting closer and closer, and the air around me felt cold, as if all the heat had been sucked away. My eyes were fixed on the two red dots that glowed in the darkness, like beacons from a nightmare. Finally, I managed to move. I turned and started running through the cemetery, tripping over tree roots and dodging ancient tombstones. The sound of my footsteps echoed between the stones, but the silence around me seemed to swallow any noise. I didn't dare look back. The iron gate was in sight, the exit so close that I felt a brief relief, until it closed by itself with a bang, the sound reverberating through the cemetery. I stood there, my heart racing, trying to open the gate. It was locked. It was then that I heard the voice again, low and drawn out, as if coming from beneath the earth. "You shouldn't have come." I turned around slowly, expecting the worst. The cemetery was empty, but I knew I wasn't alone. Shadows seemed to move between the tombstones, forming figures that disappeared before I could focus on them. My body was shaking, and each step felt heavier than the last. I decided to go back the way I had come, hoping to find another way out. The wind started blowing again, bringing with it a distant song, almost like a lament. Suddenly, an icy hand grabbed my arm. I screamed, but there was no one there. The fingerprints were imprinted on my skin, cold and painful. I kept running, now aimlessly, past tombstones and trees that seemed to go on forever. The cemetery seemed bigger, as if it were trapping me inside. Finally, I reached a clearing. In the center, there was a solitary tombstone, different from the others. It was made of black stone, smooth and polished. At the top, an inscription made me freeze. "Here lies he who dared to interrupt the rest of the damned." That's when I realized that my name was engraved on the stone. The ground began to shake slightly, and the shadow returned, emerging from behind the tombstone. It was closer now, and I could clearly see its face, or lack thereof. A mouth appeared where there had been none before, twisting into a cruel, twisted smile. "Your time is up," it whispered. I fell backward, trying to crawl away, but before I could get up, everything went dark. I woke up hours later, lying at the entrance to the cemetery, my entire body cold and aching. The gate was open, swaying gently in the wind. The sky was beginning to lighten, and silence had returned. I ran away without looking back, vowing never to set foot in Salem again. But ever since that day, something hasn't been right. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see the shadow reflected behind me. It never does anything. It just watches. And on quieter nights, I hear that whisper again, coming from the darkness. "You should never have come back." I've always been fascinated by historic places full of mystery. When I learned I would be in San Jose, I couldn't resist the chance to visit the Winchester Mystery House, famous for its labyrinthine hallways, dead-end staircases, and ghost stories. Many say the house was built to confuse spirits, but to me, it was just a legend, at least until that night. I took the guided tour during the day. The guide told us dark stories as she led us through the narrow hallways and windowless rooms. With each step, I felt the house grow more oppressive. It was easy to get lost inside, as if the walls were always moving. Everything seemed peaceful until we approached a dark hallway. The guide stopped and pointed to a door at the end of the hall. "This is the strangest room in the house," she said. "Some visitors report hearing voices or feeling a presence inside." The group laughed nervously, but I decided to return after the tour was over. Something about the way the guide had talked about that room made me curious. I wanted to see it for myself. When the tour was over, I waited until the place was almost empty. I hid behind a door and waited. At 7 o'clock in the evening, silence filled the house. I was alone. I walked slowly down the hallway, lighting my way with the flashlight on my cell phone. The place felt different at night, heavier. Each step made the floor creak slightly, and the echo of my own footsteps gave me the feeling that someone was following me. I finally reached the room. The door was ajar. A draft of cold air escaped from inside, making my skin crawl. I walked slowly inside, shining the flashlight inside. The room was small, empty, with walls covered in dark wood. In the corner, there was a rocking chair, rocking gently, although there was no wind. "Is anyone here?" I asked, my voice coming out lower than I intended. The silence answered. I was about to leave when I heard a low whisper coming from the wall. I approached slowly, trying to understand where the sound was coming from. It was then that I saw a hidden door in the corner of the room, partially covered by an old curtain. The door was not on the tour map. My hand shook as I turned the handle. The door opened with a long, sharp groan, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. I should have turned back, but I couldn't. Something was calling me to continue. I walked down the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the darkness. It was then that I heard footsteps behind me. I looked up, expecting to see someone, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, getting closer and closer. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, plunging everything into complete darkness. The darkness was complete. My heart was racing, and the only sound in the air was my own footsteps echoing through the narrow space. I tried to use the flashlight on my phone again, but the battery was dead. I was alone, in the dark, and I had no idea where I was. The air down there was thick, with a strong smell of mold and something metallic, like rust mixed with damp earth. I took a few steps forward, my hands reaching out to find a wall or a step, but everything seemed wrong, as if the space around me was changing. That was when I heard the first knock. 1, 2, 3 slow knocks. They seemed to be coming from the walls, but they changed direction every second. The sound echoed, surrounding me. I felt a chill run down my spine when a low voice whispered, very close to my ear, "You should never have come down." The survival instinct took over me. I turned around instantly and started running up the stairs, trying to remember where I had come from. But the staircase seemed endless, as if it were stuck in a cycle. My feet pounded the steps hard, and the feeling of being followed only grew stronger. Then the knocking came again, faster, louder. A dim light appeared at the end of the hallway, as if a door had been ajar. I ran toward it, panting, feeling the dread grow with each step. I reached the door and pushed it hard, falling to the floor of the main hallway of the house. The door closed behind me with a bang. My breathing was heavy, and my vision seemed blurry. The hallway was empty again, but now everything seemed darker, narrower. The walls seemed to move slightly, as if they were breathing. I looked at the door I had just come from, but it was no longer there, just a smooth, solid wall. My mind tried to find a logical explanation. All I wanted was to get out of that house as quickly as possible. I stood up, stumbling to the hall, where the front door stood open, as if inviting me to leave. I reached the door, relief washing over me. But before I left, I looked back one last time. It was then that I saw her again. At the top of the stairs, a woman in an old black dress, her face covered by a dark veil. She stood there, motionless, watching me. Her eyes shone through the veil, fixed on me. Her head tilted slightly to the side, as if she were studying me, deciding whether to let me go. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. When I looked back through the glass, she was gone. That night, I tried to forget what had happened, but the silence in my house was no longer the same. Sometimes at night, I hear those same knocks, 3 slow knocks, coming from the walls. And when I look in the mirror, I feel like I'm not alone. I always see a dark figure in the background, as if it were waiting for me. I brought something with me, something that should never have been woken up. I've always loved stories about haunted ships, but I've never really believed in them. So when I had the chance to spend a night on the Queen Mary in Long Beach, California, I didn't think twice. It was just an old ocean liner turned hotel. Nothing could be more harmless, or so I thought. The Queen Mary is known as one of the most haunted places in the United States. During World War II, it served as a military transport ship, and many say that the spirits of passengers and crew still roam its corridors. Some whisper stories of a little girl who was seen near the empty swimming pool, or of crew members who mysteriously disappeared, but it all seemed far-fetched until that night. I arrived on the ship at dusk. The golden light reflected off the rusty hull, and the air smelled of salt and rust. My room was on the B deck, next to the old boiler room, one of the places most talked about by visitors who reported strange phenomena. I found it thrilling. At first, everything seemed peaceful. The room was small but comfortable, with round windows that overlooked the harbor. After dropping off my suitcase, I decided to explore the ship. The hallways were long and quiet, with old carpeting and dark wood walls that seemed to absorb the light. The smell of oil and salt water was still present, like an echo from the past. That was when I heard the first sound. Heavy footsteps, but no one was there. The sound came from the end of the hallway, where the lights were dim. Curious, I followed the sound to a door marked "Restricted Area." The handle was cold to the touch, but the door swung open without resistance. Behind it was a staircase that led down to the ship's hold, where the old boiler room was located. The light was dim, and shadows danced on the metal walls. The air was thick, almost difficult to breathe. I took a few steps forward, the feeling that I was being watched growing with each passing second. The sound of footsteps continued, but now it was closer. "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed in the empty space. No answer. It was then that I saw the silhouette. At the end of the room, a figure stood, dressed in an old sailor's uniform. He didn't move, just watching me. The light flickered around him, and for an instant, his eyes shone in the darkness. My body froze. When I blinked, he was gone. The air grew colder, and a low voice whispered next to me, so close that I could feel the icy wind in my ear. "You shouldn't be here." My body froze. The voice still echoed in the dark room, low and drawn out, as if it were whispering directly into my mind. I looked around, but saw no one. The silence that followed was even worse. I took 2 steps back, my heart racing. The smell of burning oil and salt water grew stronger, almost suffocating. It was then that I heard the sound of water dripping behind me. I turned slowly and saw something that made my blood run cold. Water was pooling on the metal floor, forming a puddle that was growing too fast to be normal. The reflection in the water showed something that wasn't there. A girl in a white dress, standing behind me, staring straight at me with empty eyes. Before I could react, the light flickered and she disappeared. But the sound of her wet footsteps continued to echo down the hallway, as if she were running circles around me. I tried to stay calm and went back the way I had come, but the hallway seemed different. The walls were thinner, the lights were dimmer. The feeling of being followed was unbearable. That was when I heard the knocking. 3 slow knocks on the metal. The sound came from one of the old steel doors, covered in rust. My breath caught in my chest as I approached. The door shook slightly, as if something was trying to get out. "Help me," whispered a voice behind the door. My instinct told me to run, but my hand moved on its own, turning the lock. The door opened with a loud crack, revealing a dark, damp space. The smell of salt and rusty iron was unbearable. Inside the compartment, I saw the same figure of the sailor, standing with his head tilted to the side, but this time he was moving slowly towards me, his eyes glowing with an ominous light. I didn't wait to see more. I ran down the corridor, the sounds of heavy footsteps chasing me. The air was so cold that my hands went numb. Finally, I spotted the stairs I had come down from and climbed them as fast as I could. I reached the main corridor, panting, and looked back. The sound of footsteps stopped. The corridor was empty again, as if nothing had happened. But before I could calm myself, the door at the end of the hall closed by itself, and the light above it went out. The silence returned, heavier than ever. That night, I couldn't sleep. The room felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in on me. At 3 in the morning, the TV turned on by itself, showing only static. The same voice whispered once more, soft and almost gentle. "You shouldn't have come back." I left the Queen Mary before dawn, but since that day, the ship has never completely left me. Sometimes in the silence of the early morning, I hear the sound of wet footsteps on the floor, or smell the salt and rust. And every time I look in the mirror, I'm afraid I'll see the girl in the white dress again, because I know that one day she'll come back, and this time she won't disappear. Alcatraz has always fascinated me. The most famous prison in the United States, built on an island surrounded by treacherous waters, is full of stories of escape attempts and unsolved mysteries. When I had the opportunity to take a night tour, I didn't think twice. It seemed like the perfect adventure. The boat dropped us off at the island just before dusk. The sky was tinged orange, and the cool breeze carried the salty smell of the sea. As the guide led us through the empty corridors of the prison, he told stories about former prisoners, including Al Capone, and unexplained cases of disappearances and apparitions. The light was dim, shadows stretched long across the walls, and the sound of our footsteps echoed through the place. The guide pointed to one of the cells and said, "This is cell 14D, famous for being the most haunted place in the prison. His eyes lit up as he explained that many prisoners who had passed through there had reported feeling a dark presence. Some said they heard whispers, others claimed something was touching them in the dark. As the group walked away, I stayed behind, watching the cell. A strange curiosity took hold of me. I wanted to see for myself what was so special about this place. I stepped over the chain that blocked the entrance and entered. The air inside the cell was colder than in the hallway, as if something was sucking the heat out of it. The walls were damp, and the silence was so deep that it seemed to envelop me. Suddenly, the light above flickered on and off for a few seconds. It was enough to put me on alert. It took my eyes a while to adjust to the darkness, but when they did, I realized I was no longer alone. In the corner of the cell, a tall, shapeless shadow seemed to move, as if breathing. I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but then it took a step toward me. The cell door slammed shut. The sound echoed throughout the cell block, and my breath caught in my chest. I tried to push the door open, but it was locked. The hallway was empty, and the silence outside was total. It was then that I heard a low laugh, almost like a whisper. "You shouldn't be here," a hoarse voice said, coming from behind me. My entire body froze. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. But the cell was empty again, or at least it seemed to be, too. My breathing was heavy, and every muscle in my body felt stiff. The air inside the cell was colder than ever, and the feeling that something was there with me grew stronger by the second. "You shouldn't be here," the voice repeated, this time closer. I tried to say something, to ask for help, but my throat was dry. I passed the flashlight on my cell phone around the small space in the cell, but there was nothing there, at least nothing visible. Then, the sound started, slow footsteps, dragging, coming from the hallway. I looked through the small opening in the door. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued, getting closer and closer. The light at the end of the block flickered, casting shadows that moved erratically across the walls. My heart almost stopped when I noticed a silhouette in the background. It was tall, thin, dressed like an old prisoner, with its head tilted to the side. It was watching me. "Help me," the figure whispered, its voice full of desperation. Suddenly, the cell door banged open. Without a second thought, I ran out into the hallway. The sound of footsteps was now right behind me, as if the figure was following me. I ran, panting, trying to find the exit, but the hallway seemed endless, the cells repeating themselves as if they were stuck in an endless loop. The shadows on the walls became denser, almost alive, as if they were trying to grab me. Finally, I spotted the exit door. I pushed it open hard, stepping out into the courtyard outside. The cold night air enveloped me, and for a moment, I felt safe. But when I looked back, I saw the figure standing at the entrance to the hallway, watching me. His eyes were black, expressionless, but I knew he wasn't finished with me. The door closed slowly, and silence returned to the courtyard. The guide appeared a few minutes later, asking me why I was outside, shivering. I tried to explain, but he just smiled and said, "You found the prisoner in cell 14D, didn't you?" My stomach turned. Before I could answer, he added, "He always tries to escape, but he never succeeds." That night, I left Alcatraz with the feeling that something had followed me. Ever since then, I have heard slow footsteps in the hallway of my house, always in the middle of the night. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see a tall, still shadow behind me, waiting. And every time I hear that whisper, I know he is still with me. "Help me,"